And here we are on the last day of oral history for public culture, and today is the day of discussing oral history for public culture. So what do we mean by that? Well, first of all, we mean we've gone through the simple but important stages of doing any oral history, which is planning the thing, project planning. And in the case that we're in, this is also an academic quite an academically challenging moment, because you're thinking, how can I use this oral history to answer a research question? Maybe by now you've forgotten what the question was, or you realise actually doing the interviews has changed the question, or made you realise you have to be more specific about the question. But anyway, that was our beginning, first day, and we had the great Alessandro Portelli inspiring us with the uses of memory in particular, how you can use it for all kinds of disciplines and fields. We then rolled on to day two, where we were getting to the stage of interviewing itself and practicing different ways of getting people to talk, but also practicing ways of listening and active listening, the value of silence, the structure of the narrative is itself meaningful. And at that moment, we stopped into thinking ahead to the archive and the use of oral history recordings for other people. In fact, that's a theme I've been harping on since the beginning. Not just to think of this as collecting your own data, but thinking about this as potentially a permanent record for other researchers, but maybe also for generally the public, and also, of course, for the interviewee, who might want a copy of their recording, for whom the experience may have been very meaningful. So that was day two. And then this is a little picture of day three for those of you who weren't there. This was in Essex, and we had Pam Cox talking about, you can't quite see her, but herself on television interviewing refugees from the 30s, not the kinder transport that's very well known, but Jewish refugees who came over on servant visas. And it was really not so much, again, what had been the aim of the project, and not so much, again, all of the psychological fascinations of interviewing, but how did she then analyse this complex set of recordings? What theoretical frames did she bring to it? What particular methods did she bring to it? And so it was interesting, because she talked about big picture tools, I think, not so much the psychosocial, tiny, nitty-gritty, not so much the literary tools that probably a lot of us are more familiar with, but how to look at the legal context of making sense of these women's testimonies, the class context. So it was, she's coming at it really as a sociologist, social historian. And she related her methods to what she said Paul Thompson had done in the very beginning as a kind of founding father of oral history in the UK. In that for him, it was also about putting the many individual stories into a larger historical and economic, particularly, framework. So then Paul arrived at lunch and talked about this himself, but he also did situate it in a kind of world movement of oral history, which gave us lots of other perspectives on it. So that's a little bit what we did. There's Paul going around the world and talking about oral history in China, Latin America, South Africa. And then we had Libby Bishop, who is there behind Paul, giving us her example of how she reused somebody else's interviews. And I've emailed around her exercise, and particularly her coding exercise, as, again, tools for for an analytic moment of oral history. Again, with her, it was more, I think she brought in some of the questions of linguistics, translation, what you lose and gain in transcription, but particularly if you're reading somebody else's transcription. So there were lots of interesting sort of analytical challenges there. And finally, we had Julianne talking about digital humanities techniques for analysing oral history, using keyword searches at the most simple, but going up to the complex en vivo packages where you do complex forms of coding to really, really, again, look for patterns that might take you beyond the individual story. So I just thought I'd fill you in, and also by way of doing that, show you we have a nice blog, which you may have hopefully looked at, but on which we could put pictures of today as the final end to the course, and put links to your projects, we hope. And could I just add in by saying a few words on public culture as the key term for today, because we're now at that final stage in an oral history project, which is how do I present my work? It might be, for an academic, you do nothing more than do a rather dull conference paper. Fine, that's the way that you normally do it. But with oral history, we have the opportunity to be much more multimedia. We inherently have the power of sound with the power of the voice. But I also wanted to say that I think we're in an age when actually more is demanded of us than just academics talking to other academics. We're in a time when I think history, or all disciplines, are under pressure to speak more publicly, but to also answer to the public. So, you know, some of the pressures are government, state-funded demands for impact. You know, we got to prove we're worth the funding that went into us. We need to show we're socially useful. So what could be the uses of oral historical accounts and records, you know? And here we have the Heritage Lottery Fund that will really give us some examples, I think, of how we could seemingly be useful to communities, part of communities. There are also maybe bigger historical kinds of sort of flows underneath this, around the democratization of knowledge, the idea that history is about political assertion, you know, the creation of identities and communities. And, you know, I think it's not only a pressure from above, it's not only instrumental, an instrumental idea. Actually, public culture also is the result of a lot of social movements claiming to be represented. And oral history, as we know, has traditionally in the UK been seen as a very socialist, feminist and generally radical tool, and it's been seen as a way of asserting that claim to the public sphere and that claim to identity. So that's where public culture, it's an interesting term because it's becoming itself slightly institutionalised along with public history, but it's a moment of opportunity for us, I think, to play with it. I think my final point there is to say that it does also demand us not just to define whose history and whose culture, but what is the public? What is our theory of the public sphere, the public? And, you know, we could go back to Habermas, the philosopher who talked about the public as coming out of an idea of secular modernity, 18th century. This is the moment when you get an educated society able to talk to itself without being simply dominated by an autocratic government. That's the sort of older version of a kind of radical public. I think there are sort of limitations with that, partly because it's very much based on a sort of European model. But we might want to hold on to the idea of it as connected to civic society, conversation among equals, and think about how that's being reframed in an age of digital societies and conversations. And also, and here's my final theoretical reference for you today, an age of intimate publics, the pluralisation of the public sphere through these different groups, through digital technology, but also through, I think, the bringing in of feminist ideas of the public sphere. So here's my theoretical reference is Lauren Berlant, Berlant, who sort of talks back to Habermas as the older philosopher, by saying we live in an age of intimate publics, and these are more personalised, they're more emotional, they're more gender aware, they're more plural. And I think that sort of gives us an interesting test case to now think about how we are trying to create public conversations with our oral history productions, if you like, and what kinds of publics are we actually going to try and speak to or even create. So there's my little intro. I will now hand over to Nirmal with great pleasure, and thank you.